Imagine a world where a single storm could starve an entire city. In 1888, a monster blizzard buried New York under 50 inches of snow. But this lethal whiteout, look at these haunting images of streets choked by ice and bodies trapped in the drifts. Before this storm, the idea of traveling beneath the pavement was considered a nightmare. What if the subway was a desperate response to a weather disaster? The Great Blizzard of 1888 paralyzed a nation. It proved life on the surface was too vulnerable, paving the way for the subway.
Prelude to the storm. In the winter of 1888, New York City stood at the crossroads of progress and chaos, a bustling metropolis teetering between the past and the future. Horse-drawn carriages clattered across icy cobblestone streets, their iron-shod wheels ringing sharp notes that echoed between the brick and brownstone buildings. Street vendors peddled hot chestnuts and steaming bowls of soup, their calls cutting through the frigid air, while children trudged home from school, scarves pulled tight around their necks. Steam hissed from manhole covers, and the faint clatter of streetcars on rails hinted at the growing infrastructure that sought to tame the chaos of urban life. Yet beneath this lively surface, the city was fragile. The winter of 1878 to 1888 had been unusually harsh, leaving New Yorkers wary of what lay ahead. Early January had brought snow, but nothing compared to the storm that would soon arrive. The city was unprepared for what meteorologists would later call one of the most devastating blizzards in American history. It was a time before modern forecasting, when weather predictions relied on telegraph reports, rudimentary instruments, and the keen eyes of observers perched on rooftops. Newspapers carried bold headlines predicting cold snaps and snow squalls, but the magnitude of the coming disaster would escape even the most seasoned minds. The streets themselves told the story of vulnerability. Horse-drawn omnibuses and streetcars were the lifelines of urban mobility, but they depended entirely on accessible streets and healthy animals. Snowfall of even moderate depth could halt them entirely. Electric trolleys were still rare, confined to certain experimental routes, and the city's gas lamps, while flickering valiantly against the darkness, could be snuffed out by wind or ice. The city's residents, merchants, clerks, laborers, and children went about their daily routines with little thought of the calamity that nature was preparing. Social life thrived despite the cold. Families gathered around fireplaces in cramped apartments, trading stories and news of distant relatives. The immigrant neighborhoods buzzed with activity, shops selling fabrics, foodstuffs, and imported goods from every corner of the globe. Business leaders paced offices with telegraph messages across the nation, calculating shipments and stock transactions, while politicians in City Hall debated matters of infrastructure and reform. Each segment of society, from wealthy financiers to street sweepers, faced its own unique set of challenges navigating winter life, yet none anticipated the storm that would bind them together in survival. The political climate added another layer to the city's tension. Mayor Abram S. Hewitt, a man of vision yet constrained by municipal bureaucracy, oversaw a city in transition. Debates raged over public works projects, sanitation, and the growing population that crowded Manhattan and spread outward into Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx. Snow removal was a perennial challenge, with horse-drawn plows and shovels proving inadequate even under normal conditions. Streets were narrow, intersections chaotic, and alleys often impassable after just a few inches of snowfall. The city's leadership understood winter's menace abstractly, but there was no precedent for what was about to unfold. Railways connecting New York to the broader Northeast were vital arteries for commerce and communication. The Long Island Railroad, Pennsylvania Railroad, and New York Central lines ferried passengers and freight in and out of the city. Each train schedule represented the delicate balance of timeliness and survival. Even minor weather disruptions could create cascading delays. The telegraph lines crisscrossing the state relayed urgent messages about freight, weather, and passenger conditions, but they were still susceptible to ice and wind. The interconnectedness of modern life, exciting though it was, magnified the city's vulnerability. Among the city's residents, stories circulated of unusually strong gusts and bitterly cold nights as February and early March progressed. Fishermen reported rough seas along the harbor, ice forming in narrow bands along the river. Dock workers noticed that the tide patterns were erratic, slowed by thin sheets of ice that crept outward from piers. Newspapers hinted at disturbances in the Atlantic weather patterns, but these reports were largely treated as curiosity rather than warning. For the average New Yorker, life went on as usual. Children built small snow forts and engaged in snowball skirmishes in Central Park, while street urchins darted through alleys selling newspapers and candy, oblivious to the threat gathering hundreds of miles away. Economic life also revealed the city's precariousness. Markets depended on timely delivery of goods, and any disruption could ripple across neighborhoods. Dairy deliveries, for example, were handled by horse-drawn wagons, and meat was transported without refrigeration, often relying on ice packed in wooden boxes. Heavy snowfall threatened to halt this fragile network entirely. At the docks, cargo ships unloaded coal, wheat, and manufactured goods, while dock workers braced against the elements, oblivious to the fact that within days the harbor itself would be clogged with ice and immobilized vessels. Technology of the day was both a promise and a limitation. Gas lamps lit the streets, though they required manual maintenance. Early electric lights were experimental and mostly confined to offices and affluent homes. Telegraphs enabled rapid communication across the region, but the lines were exposed to the elements. Horse-drawn carriages and omnibuses moved at the mercy of snow and ice, while the idea of an underground solution, later to become the subway, was still largely theoretical, discussed by engineers and civic planners who had yet to confront the urgency imposed by nature. Culturally, New Yorkers maintained a blend of resilience and bravado. Theater performances, lectures, and church gatherings continued through harsh weather, reflecting a determination to maintain social cohesion. Restaurants and saloons were hubs of warmth, conversation, and news. Yet these cultural markers also reflected the fragility of city life. Any interruption in daily routines, whether due to snow, illness, or mechanical failure, could cascade into widespread disruption. In the winter of 1888, this tension was mounting, unnoticed by most. Meanwhile, across the broader Northeast, meteorologists monitored storms forming over the Great Lakes and the northern Atlantic. Reports of cold fronts and high winds traveled by telegraph to New York City, but the public remained largely unaware. For many, snow was simply another inconvenience, a challenge to be weathered. Farmers in upstate New York and New England noted the heavy precipitation, while mariners adjusted their routes. Still, the full scale of the approaching blizzard remained unknown, an invisible threat converging upon the city with relentless force. Thus, New York City in early 1888 was a city of contrasts, innovation alongside vulnerability, bustling commerce alongside fragile transport, and resilient social life alongside unpredictable weather. Its streets, buildings, and people were all on the cusp of an event that would reshape the city forever. The Great Blizzard, which historians later called the White Hurricane, would expose every weakness in urban planning, communication, and transportation. Yet it would also spark ingenuity, laying the groundwork for the modern subway and forever changing the way New Yorkers navigated their city. This was a city unaware that its ordinary winter routines would soon be shattered. In homes, offices, and streets, life continued as usual, unaware that a storm unlike any other in recorded history was forming on the horizon. A storm that would bury streets in snow, strand tens of thousands, and force the birth of innovations that would redefine urban life.
Meteorological warning signs. By early March of 1888, the air over the northeastern United States was already trembling with hints of an approaching calamity. From the icy expanses of the Great Lakes to the Atlantic coastline, nature was stirring a storm of unprecedented magnitude. For meteorologists and weather observers, the signs were subtle but undeniable. Pressure drops in barometers, increasing gusts of wind, sudden shifts in temperature, and the whisper of snow on distant landscapes. Yet the city of New York, vibrant and bustling as ever, remained largely unaware of the severity of what was approaching. Life moved with the customary rhythm of winter. Horse-drawn carriages on cobblestones, street vendors navigating icy sidewalks, families huddled around fireplaces, oblivious to the storm that would soon grind the city to a halt. At the center of early warning efforts stood the United States Weather Bureau, established just over a decade prior in 1870. The Bureau's task was monumental, monitoring atmospheric conditions across vast regions with limited instruments, telegraph reports, and sparse human observers. The science of meteorology was still in its infancy, reliant upon rudimentary barometers, thermometers, anemometers, and telegraphic transmissions. Observers stationed in towns and cities across the Northeast sent hourly reports on temperature, wind direction, humidity, and snowfall. These reports were pieced together at regional offices to produce a preliminary forecast, an effort both heroic and prone to error. One such observer, stationed in Albany, New York, noted on March 9th a sudden dip in barometric pressure paired with rapidly shifting winds. Across the Hudson Valley, telegraph operators relayed messages of heavy snowfall and rising drifts, hinting at a storm developing over the upper Midwest. In Boston, meteorologists recorded similar phenomena: unusual cloud formations, bitterly cold winds from the northwest, and early snow accumulations that were inconsistent with normal seasonal patterns. These reports were all forwarded to New York City, where the Bureau attempted to piece together the trajectory of the coming storm. However, the city's newspapers largely treated these warnings as curiosity rather than cause for alarm, emphasizing local events, politics, and social gatherings over meteorological threats. The public's understanding of storms was filtered through a mix of folklore, limited scientific explanation, and the occasional newspaper article. While some citizens paid attention to barometers in shop windows or listened to the occasional report from the Weather Bureau, most winter residents simply adapted to snow as part of city life. A few particularly observant individuals noticed the unusual wind patterns or the sudden drop in temperature, but there was no collective sense that an extraordinary event was imminent. Children played in early snowfalls, merchants prepared standard winter inventories, and commuters adjusted their horse-drawn carriages for ordinary icy conditions, all unaware that these preparations were woefully insufficient. Telegraph networks played a pivotal role in the dissemination of meteorological information, bridging the gap between distant observations and local awareness. Lines stretched from Chicago, Buffalo, and Albany to New York City, carrying coded messages that translated complex meteorological data into warnings of potential storms. Yet the system was not foolproof. Ice and snow could damage lines, operators could misread signals, and the interpretation of data required experience that few possessed. Messages often arrived too late or were incomplete, leaving city officials with an imperfect picture of the storm's strength and path. When reports of heavy snowfall in the Midwest reached New York on March 10th, many assumed it would dissipate before reaching the city, an assumption that would prove catastrophically wrong. Meanwhile, newspapers like the New York Tribune, the Sun, and the New York Times attempted to cover the storm as it approached, balancing meteorological reports with stories of city life, politics, and entertainment. Headlines hinted at a northern storm approaching or a potential snow squall, but these warnings lacked urgency. Few readers understood the severity implied by barometric readings, wind velocities, or the reports of hundreds of miles of snow-laden landscapes to the west. Even when the papers published advisory notices from the Weather Bureau, citizens often dismissed them as exaggeration, another example of the city's cultural optimism and resilience in the face of natural threats. For those who did pay attention, the signs were ominous. Ferry operators along the East River reported choppy, icy waters. Dock workers noticed thin sheets of ice forming along piers and inlets. Farmers and traders in upstate New York began delaying shipments of perishable goods. Merchants fretted over the reliability of horse-drawn deliveries in the coming days. Even in Central Park, park keepers observed an unusual buildup of snow along tree branches, hinting at the weight the city might soon endure. These small but telling observations hinted at a storm of unusual intensity, yet the message had yet to penetrate the city's consciousness in full. Scientists and early meteorologists debated the causes and trajectory of the storm with meticulous care. They relied on synoptic charts, a relatively new tool that mapped temperature, pressure, and wind over wide areas. One observer noted that a low-pressure system was forming over the Great Lakes, drawing cold Arctic air southward and moist Atlantic air northward, a classic setup for a blizzard. Meteorologists understood that such a combination could produce heavy snowfall, strong winds, and prolonged disruptions, yet the ability to accurately forecast the exact timing and intensity was limited. Despite these limitations, reports were sent daily to New York's Weather Bureau office, where staff attempted to advise city officials on necessary precautions. In homes and businesses, some residents took heed of these warnings, boarding up windows, stocking extra firewood, and adjusting deliveries. But the majority carried on with normal routines, confident in the city's ability to weather the storms of winter. Children continued to play outside, merchants prepared for ordinary snowfalls, and transportation continued unabated. Horse-drawn omnibuses ran scheduled routes, streetcars rattled along their rails, and ferries transported passengers across icy rivers. There was a collective sense that winter had always been manageable, that the city's bustling energy could withstand even significant snow. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, tension was building in subtle ways. The pressure drops recorded in barometers were sharper than usual. Telegraph operators in Boston, Albany, and Philadelphia reported intermittent snowstorms and gusting winds. The Atlantic coastal waters were restless, with mariners noting unusual swells and currents. Each small observation hinted at a storm of unusual intensity, yet the message had yet to penetrate the city's consciousness in full. Scientists and early meteorologists debated the causes and trajectory of the storm with meticulous care. They relied on synoptic charts, a relatively new tool that mapped temperature, pressure, and wind over wide areas. One observer noted that a low-pressure system was forming over the Great Lakes, drawing cold Arctic air southward and moist Atlantic air northward, a classic setup for a blizzard. Meteorologists understood that such a combination could produce heavy snowfall, strong winds, and prolonged disruptions, yet the ability to accurately forecast the exact timing and intensity was limited. Despite these limitations, reports were sent daily to New York's Weather Bureau office, where staff attempted to advise city officials on necessary precautions. In homes and businesses, some residents took heed of these warnings, boarding up windows, stocking extra firewood, and adjusting deliveries. But the majority carried on with normal routines, confident in the city's ability to weather the storms of winter. Children continued to play outside, merchants prepared for ordinary snowfalls, and transportation continued unabated. Horse-drawn omnibuses ran scheduled routes, streetcars rattled along their rails, and ferries transported passengers across icy rivers. There was a collective sense that winter had always been manageable, that the city's bustling energy could withstand even significant snow. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, tension was building in subtle ways. The pressure drops recorded in barometers were sharper than usual. Telegraph operators in Boston, Albany, and Philadelphia reported intermittent snowstorms and gusting winds.
The Atlantic coastal waters were restless, with mariners noting unusual swells and currents. Each small observation hinted at a storm of unusual intensity, yet the message had yet to penetrate the city's consciousness in full. Scientists and early meteorologists debated the causes and trajectory of the storm with meticulous care. They relied on synoptic charts, a relatively new tool that mapped temperature, pressure, and wind over wide areas. One observer noted that a low-pressure system was forming over the Great Lakes, drawing cold Arctic air southward and moist Atlantic air northward, a classic setup for a blizzard. Meteorologists
The first snowfalls and escalation. As March 11, 1888 dawned, New York City awoke to a day that seemed ordinary at first glance. The winter sun struggled to pierce a blanket of gray clouds, casting pale light across the cobblestone streets and brick facades. The air was sharper than usual, and a faint powdering of snow clung to windowsills and rooftops. But for most citizens, this was merely the tail end of winter's typical offerings. Horse-drawn carriages plodded through slushy streets, vendors set up their stalls, and office clerks hurried along the sidewalks, umbrellas clutched in anticipation of precipitation that, until now, had been only minor. Yet, for the more observant New Yorkers, the meteorologists, telegraph operators, and steely-eyed dock workers, the signs were unmistakable. The barometer had dropped further overnight, the wind shifted northwest, and the snow, though light, carried a persistent chill that hinted at the storm gathering strength over the interior states. Telegraph lines buzzed with intermittent messages from Albany, Buffalo, and even as far west as Cleveland, reporting heavier snowfalls and accumulating drifts. Engineers at the Long Island Railroad noted delays and difficulties in clearing tracks, while ferry operators along the East River struggled against the first gusts of wind that sent icy spray over piers. By mid-morning, the snow intensified. What began as a dusting quickly thickened into a relentless fine powder that blanketed streets in layers of white. Pedestrians trudged forward, boots sinking into accumulating snow, while horses strained against sleds and wagons carrying goods and passengers. Commuters laughed nervously at the inconvenience, treating the growing drifts as the usual winter challenge. Street vendors, however, grew concerned. As their wares became covered in snow, customers dwindled, and the cold threatened to freeze both hands and merchandise. The first signs of disruption were subtle but telling. Streetcars, which had continued their morning routes, began to slow under the weight of ice and snow clinging to the rails. Horses, accustomed to winter work but unprepared for the deepening drifts, stumbled or refused to move, forcing drivers to abandon carts mid-route. Telegraph operators reported intermittent line failures, some caused by heavy snow weighing down wires, others by gusts tearing through exposed lines. In offices and homes alike, people noticed flickering gas lamps and occasional outages, reminders that even the simplest city services were vulnerable under worsening conditions. Throughout the day, social life began to bend under the storm's pressure. Schools dismissed students early, though parents struggled to reach them on snow-covered streets. Churches saw reduced attendance, and theaters canceled afternoon performances. Yet the city's bustling energy persisted. Merchants continued to sell goods, cab drivers sought customers, and workers attempted to maintain schedules despite the growing inconvenience. There was a collective underestimation of what lay ahead. Most believed that by nightfall the snow would ease, as it had in prior winters. By late afternoon, however, the snow intensified with a ferocity that startled even seasoned citizens. Drifts began to accumulate along curbs and in intersections, and gusts of wind transformed the snowfall into a near whiteout. Visibility dropped sharply, forcing carriages to slow dramatically or stop entirely. Children who had ventured out to play were called home, and families shuttered windows against the increasing chill. Merchants in lower Manhattan noted that deliveries were becoming impossible as horse-drawn wagons were unable to navigate the thickening snow. Streetcars ground to a halt, and elevated rail lines groaned under the weight of ice and high winds. Amid the chaos, personal stories emerged, revealing the human dimension of the early blizzard. A young clerk walking home from Wall Street slipped on icy pavement, narrowly avoiding a collision with a plowing horse-drawn cart. A family in Brooklyn, returning from visiting relatives, found themselves trapped by drifts 3 feet deep along the avenue, forced to huddle in a corner stoop until neighbors helped dig a path. Dock workers along the East River struggled to secure cargo as icy gusts tore sheets from crates, while ferrymen battled waves laced with floating ice, delaying crossings and leaving passengers stranded. These incidents, though scattered, were harbingers of the widespread paralysis to come. Even the city's newspapers, which had reported on the storm for days, struggled to keep pace with developments. Editorial offices were hampered by slow deliveries of fresh news, disrupted telegraph lines, and snow-covered streets that prevented reporters from reaching key locations. Headlines shifted from casual mentions of northern storm approaching to urgent alerts, snow deepens across the city, and commuters struggle amid worsening weather. Yet the magnitude of the storm remained underappreciated by many. Citizens assumed these were exaggerations, typical of the press's flair for drama, rather than accurate reports of a historic blizzard in progress. As evening approached on March 11th, the storm escalated further. Snowfall became nearly continuous, with winds driving the white powder into streets, alleys, and doorways. Horses, exhausted from hours of labor in deepening snow, collapsed along streets, forcing drivers to abandon wagons and seek assistance. Streetcars were immobilized, and sidewalks vanished beneath drifts. Citizens who had initially treated the storm as minor now faced a creeping sense of alarm. Families gathered fires, stores closed early, and emergency workers began to organize to assist those trapped or stranded. The meteorologists and telegraph operators monitoring the storm in New York and surrounding states realized the unprecedented nature of what was unfolding. Snowfall totals far exceeded initial predictions, and wind speeds escalated, generating near-zero visibility in exposed areas. Reports from New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Connecticut mirrored those from Manhattan, disrupted transport, blocked streets, and growing human strain. The storm was no longer a simple inconvenience, it was a crisis in the making. Yet, for many ordinary citizens, the realization was gradual, unfolding only as horse-drawn omnibuses ground to a halt, ferries delayed indefinitely, and the relentless accumulation of snow began to transform familiar streets into unrecognizable drifts and mounds. By the night of March 11th, the first true effects of the blizzard were unmistakable. Families huddled indoors, firewood dwindling, and food supplies constrained by stalled deliveries. City streets, once arteries of commerce and social life, were now obstructed by snowdrifts that rose above carriage wheels. Horses, the lifeblood of transport, were exhausted and unable to move. Telegraph operators worked feverishly, sending messages of disruption and emergency to regional offices, while newspapers, struggling to print and deliver issues, published urgent warnings of heavier snowfall to come. The storm, once distant and abstract, had arrived in force, leaving New York City teetering at the precipice of chaos. Thus, the first snowfalls of March 11th and the early escalation of the storm revealed both the resilience and vulnerability of New York City. Citizens faced an unfamiliar challenge that exposed the limits of their infrastructure, technology, and daily routines. What had begun as an ordinary winter morning evolved into a crisis that would paralyze transport, disrupt communication, and threaten lives. The city was on the brink of a historic confrontation with nature, one that would test the ingenuity, endurance, and spirit of every resident. The blizzard hits. By the early hours of March 12, 1888, New York City had transformed into a city suspended in white. The blizzard that meteorologists had tracked for days finally descended with full force, turning familiar streets into treacherous mazes of snow and ice. What had begun as a persistent snowfall now escalated into a furious tempest, with wind gusts exceeding 45 miles per hour, driving snow into streets, windows, and alleyways with relentless pressure. Visibility was reduced to near zero. A person standing on a sidewalk could barely see beyond a few feet. Horse-drawn omnibuses and streetcars, once the lifeblood of urban mobility, were now immobilized. Horses, strained beyond endurance from navigating the growing drifts, collapsed or refused to move, leaving wagons abandoned in intersections. Drivers sought refuge on building stoops, while passengers climbed onto rooftops or huddled in doorways. Elevated rail lines creaked and groaned under the combined weight of ice, snow, and the mechanical stress of engines attempting to move. Ferries along the East River were moored indefinitely, their decks swarming with passengers stranded by waves laced with ice. The entire transport network, both above and near water, had ground to a halt. Communication, too, faltered under the storm's weight. Telegraph lines, already vulnerable, were severed in several locations by falling limbs or the accumulation of ice. Telegraph operators worked feverishly to maintain connections, sending urgent warnings to regional offices and neighboring states. Yet even these efforts were piecemeal, often arriving hours late or not at all. For the citizens, this was a terrifying realization. The city was not only snowbound, but increasingly isolated. Mail delivery stalled, news updates slowed, and families found themselves unable to communicate with relatives outside Manhattan, Brooklyn, or New Jersey. The human stories emerging during this time were vivid and sobering. Families huddled together in apartments without adequate heating, relying on fireplaces and stoves that struggled to keep rooms above freezing. Children, once laughing in the early snow, were confined indoors, while elderly residents faced the double threat of cold and immobility. Along the streets, accounts emerged of brave neighbors helping one another dig out trapped carriages, pull horses from drifts, and deliver food and firewood to those stranded. Volunteerism and resourcefulness surged in tandem with fear and desperation. Street vendors and small merchants, who had initially treated the snow as a minor inconvenience, now faced near total loss of business. Their carts were buried under drifts, supplies ruined by freezing conditions, and clientele unable to reach their stalls. In larger commercial districts like Wall Street and Fulton Street, offices were nearly deserted as employees were trapped in homes or struggled to navigate impassable streets. The New York Stock Exchange, normally a hive of frenzied activity, saw attendance plummet, and communication with outlying cities was disrupted. The economy, momentarily, came to a grinding halt. In Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx, similar chaos unfolded. Horse-drawn wagons carrying essential goods were abandoned on avenues buried in snow. Public services struggled to reach those in need, with fire brigades and police forces hindered by impassable streets. Citizens formed human chains to rescue neighbors, remove snow-blocked doors, and deliver messages. In many ways, the storm revealed both the interdependence of urban life and the vulnerabilities inherent in a city designed without anticipation of such extremes. The storm's intensity continued to escalate over March 12th, snow accumulating at an astonishing rate of 2 to 4 inches per hour in Manhattan, and even faster in exposed areas like Brooklyn and Long Island. Drifts along streets quickly exceeded 6 to 10 feet, trapping carriages, overturning wagons, and burying stairways. Elevated rail tracks, once a symbol of industrial progress, groaned under the accumulating ice and snow. Occasionally, a train would attempt to move, only to stall halfway, leaving passengers exposed to the bitter wind and pelting snow. Waterways and ports were equally affected. The East and Hudson rivers were churned by gusting winds, forming ice ridges that prevented ferry crossings and stranded vessels. Dock workers struggled to secure cargo, often risking frostbite and injury. Ice floes crashed into piers, breaking crates and scattering goods along frozen water lines. Ships that had been delayed for days were left trapped in harbor, their crews improvising to prevent damage and loss. The storm's reach, though concentrated over New York City, extended along the northeast coastline, affecting commerce, travel, and communication in neighboring states. Amid the unfolding crisis, heroic stories of survival emerged. Firemen and policemen, despite exhaustion and freezing temperatures, rescued families trapped in homes, guided travelers through snow-laden streets, and assisted in moving essential supplies. Ordinary citizens dug out neighbors, carried provisions to those isolated by drifts, and found ingenious ways to navigate the impassable cityscape. One account described a man guiding a small child across a snowbank 3 times his height to reach a neighbor's warm hearth. In another, a group of neighbors formed a line to deliver milk and bread to a family on the top floor of a multi-storied tenement whose tenement well was buried under snow. As night fell on March 12th, the full impact of the blizzard became undeniable. The city was immobilized, communication was fractured, and lives were at risk. Streets were unrecognizable beneath mountains of snow, and the relentless wind continued to hurl flakes into every exposed surface. Gas lamps flickered in the storm, often extinguished entirely, leaving darkened streets that amplified the sense of isolation. Families huddled around fires, rationing food and wood, while emergency responders faced the immense task of reaching the most vulnerable. The storm's unprecedented intensity also prompted reflection among city officials and planners. Observing the paralysis of transportation, the breakdown of communication, and the vulnerability of essential services, engineers and municipal leaders began to consider long-term solutions for a city susceptible to such extremes. Elevated rail lines, streetcars, and horse-drawn wagons, all so crucial in daily life, were clearly inadequate in the face of nature's fury. The realization was gradual but profound. New York City required a system insulated from the storm, capable of keeping commerce, transportation, and communication moving even when snow blanketed the streets. This recognition would sow the seeds of the subway system, an idea born directly from the blizzard's devastating impact. By the early morning of March 13th, New Yorkers awoke to a landscape forever altered. The blizzard had deposited an extraordinary amount of snow, combined with winds that created towering drifts and near-zero visibility. Horses were exhausted, were dead, carriages abandoned, streetcars stalled, and ferries grounded. Communication remained sporadic, and daily life was effectively suspended. For the city, the blizzard was no longer a weather event, it was a transformative disaster, reshaping urban life, testing resilience, and revealing the urgent need for innovation. In these 2 days of March 12th and 13th, New York had entered the heart of the Great Blizzard, facing nature's relentless force in ways never imagined. The storm would continue, leaving its mark not only on streets and buildings, but on the psyche of the city itself, demonstrating with brutal clarity that urban life demanded adaptation, foresight, and technological evolution. The human stories of survival, ingenuity, and loss that unfolded during this period would echo in history and provide the blueprint for the structural changes that would follow. Most notably, the creation of the modern subway system that would forever transform the way New Yorkers navigated their city.
Chaos in transportation. By March 13, 1888, New York City's transportation systems had been pushed to their absolute limits and then broken entirely. The first and most immediate casualties were the horse-drawn carriages and omnibuses that filled the streets with clatter in ordinary winters. Snowdrifts, some as high as 10 feet in exposed areas, trapped carriages mid-avenue, leaving drivers and passengers stranded for hours. Horses, exhausted from continuous labor in deep snow and icy conditions, often collapsed or became unmanageable. Drivers abandoned wagons in intersections, forcing pedestrians to navigate around them and creating impromptu snow barricades that blocked even the most determined travelers. Streetcars fared little better. Tracks buried beneath snow and ice became treacherous, while overhead wires, where present, froze or snapped under the strain of freezing wind and ice. Early electric trolleys, experimental and limited in scope, were virtually useless. Steam-driven streetcars on longer suburban routes were immobilized, leaving passengers stranded at stations with no shelter from the storm. Reports from the Brooklyn Heights area described passengers huddling inside stalled cars for warmth, while drifts piled against doors, creating the terrifying impression of entombment in snow. Elevated trains, those iron arteries threading above Manhattan and Brooklyn, were not immune to disaster. Snow and ice accumulated on tracks, overhead structures, and platforms, causing engines to stall or derail. Gusts of wind bent the lines of the railings, swaying entire trains, while snowdrifts blocked access to stations. Elevated rail operators attempted to run partial service, but delays were extreme, and communication between stations became sporadic due to severed telegraph lines. For many commuters, the elevated trains, once a symbol of modernity and mobility, were rendered useless by nature's force. The ferries that connected Manhattan to Brooklyn, Jersey City, and other points along the East River were also grounded. Ice floes, driven by relentless winds, prevented vessels from docking safely. Captains struggled to navigate treacherous waters, while crews fought against waves littered with floating ice. Passengers were left stranded along piers, often waiting hours for transport or forced to seek alternative, often dangerous routes. The ferry chaos not only immobilized ordinary commuters, but disrupted the vital flow of goods and trade across the harbor, threatening essential supplies to the city. Railroads leading into and out of the city faced similarly catastrophic conditions. The Long Island Railroad, Pennsylvania Railroad, and New York Central lines reported severe delays and immobilized trains. Tracks were buried under snow, switch points frozen, and signal systems disrupted. Passengers were trapped in stations or carriages, sometimes overnight, without adequate food, heat, or sanitation. Freight trains carrying coal, food, and other essentials were immobilized, threatening shortages in homes and businesses across the metropolitan area. The city's dependence on these regional lifelines had become painfully clear. Even ordinary pedestrians faced extreme challenges. Sidewalks were impassable, alleyways turned into treacherous slopes, and snowdrifts blocked doorways and entrances to businesses and homes. Many citizens improvised paths through drifts using shovels or planks, while others risked venturing out into whiteout conditions to reach essential destinations. Reports emerged of citizens using ladders to cross snow mounds, teams of volunteers forming human chains to guide neighbors through dangerous streets, and children improvising sleds to navigate deep drifts.
This transportation collapse had cascading effects across the city. Businesses could not receive deliveries, offices remained empty as employees could not reach work, schools shut down entirely, and emergency services were hindered by the same impassable streets that trapped ordinary citizens. Fire brigades, already limited in their capacity to fight fires, struggled to move horses and engines through snow-blocked streets. Policemen patrolled on foot, but even they found mobility restricted in many neighborhoods. The sheer scale of disruption highlighted the fragility of the city's surface-level transportation infrastructure. The chaos also underscored social inequalities in mobility. Wealthier citizens, who might afford private carriages or access to better-maintained streets, were still partially sheltered from the worst effects. Poorer families, reliant on streetcars or public ferries, faced the full brunt of the storm. Entire immigrant neighborhoods in Lower Manhattan, Brooklyn, and the Bronx were effectively cut off, struggling with frozen water, dwindling food supplies, and near total isolation. Public services, which depended on surface mobility, could reach only limited areas, leaving some sections of the city completely inaccessible for days. The storm forced creative improvisation. Citizens built temporary bridges across drifts to access neighboring streets. Volunteers cleared paths for essential deliveries, often using shovels, planks, or sledges to transport food, milk, and firewood. Streetcar crews attempted to clear tracks using manual labor, while railroad workers dug tunnels and breaks through snowdrifts to maintain minimal operations. Yet all these efforts were limited in scope. The sheer force of the storm overwhelmed even the most determined human effort. The blizzard revealed glaring vulnerabilities in New York City's transportation system. Surface-level dependence on horse-drawn vehicles, streetcars, and ferries had created a fragile network incapable of functioning during prolonged snowstorms. Elevated trains, while impressive, were exposed to wind and ice, limiting their reliability. Railroads depended on exposed tracks and switching systems that froze during extreme weather. Communication lines necessary for coordinating transportation were easily severed. The city's infrastructure, designed for ordinary winters, was entirely unprepared for the magnitude of the Great Blizzard. These revelations planted the seeds of a radical idea, a transportation system protected from the elements. City planners, engineers, and civic leaders recognized that to prevent future paralysis, New York required a means of moving people and goods underground, away from snow, wind, and ice. Discussions that had been theoretical about subways, tunnels, and insulated routes now gained urgency. The storm had made one fact undeniable. Above-ground transportation, no matter how advanced, was vulnerable, unreliable, and inadequate for a modern, growing metropolis. By March 14th, as the blizzard continued its relentless assault, New Yorkers realized that life as they knew it had been suspended. Streets were filled with towering drifts, carriages lay abandoned, trains stalled, and ferries remained grounded. Emergency services reached only the most critical cases, leaving citizens dependent on neighbors and community networks for survival. The collapse of transportation was not just an inconvenience, it was a crisis that imperiled commerce, communication, and basic daily life. In the aftermath of the storm, the chaos of transportation would become a defining narrative of the Great Blizzard. The paralysis of horse-drawn vehicles, streetcars, ferries, and railroads demonstrated the limitations of surface mobility and forced civic leaders to confront a new reality. New York City needed a subterranean solution. This insight directly shaped the development of the modern subway system, a project conceived in response to the vulnerabilities laid bare by the storm. Communication breakdown. By March 13th and 14th, 1888, as the Great Blizzard reached its full intensity, New York City faced a crisis not only of movement, but of communication. In an era when the telegraph was king, the telephone was in its infancy, and newspapers were the primary source of public information, the blizzard exposed the fragile infrastructure on which the city's knowledge and coordination depended. Messages failed to reach intended recipients. Important dispatches were delayed or lost, and ordinary citizens discovered, often too late, how isolated they could become in an emergency. Telegraph lines, which crisscrossed Manhattan and connected New York to the broader Northeast, were among the first casualties of the storm. Wooden poles bent under the weight of ice and snow. Wires snapped in the relentless wind, and short circuits disabled entire networks. Operators, many working in poorly insulated offices or atop buildings exposed to the storm, faced freezing temperatures, snowdrifts piling against doors, and the constant threat of electrical malfunction. Attempts to transmit urgent messages across state lines or even within the city frequently failed. Long-distance communication to Albany, Boston, or Philadelphia became unreliable, leaving local officials without accurate reports on conditions elsewhere in the region. The limitations of the telephone, a relatively new technology at the time, compounded the problem. Exchanges were few and rudimentary, with manual switchboards connecting calls through human operators. The storm interfered with the wires, creating static, dropped connections, and complete line failures. Citizens attempting to check on family members or coordinate work were often met with dead lines or prolonged wait times. Businesses dependent on telephone communication for scheduling deliveries or confirming transactions found themselves paralyzed. Unlike the telegraph, which could relay messages long distances even under duress, the telephone system remained too fragile and localized to function effectively in extreme weather. Newspapers, the lifeline of daily news, were also significantly hampered. Reporters found it nearly impossible to travel to story locations as streets became impassable. Delivery boys struggled through deep drifts, often abandoning papers along sidewalks or leaving them wet, frozen, and unreadable. Offices attempted to print emergency editions, but supply chains for ink, paper, and printing materials were disrupted by halted transport. By mid-March 13th, many households and businesses found themselves without reliable news for nearly 24 hours, a frightening prospect as the blizzard intensified. Headlines, when they did appear, were often delayed or outdated, reporting conditions as they had been hours before. The communication breakdown had immediate human consequences. Families isolated by snowdrifts had no way to contact neighbors or emergency services. Fires in small buildings could not be reported in time, and by the time firefighters reached them, access was severely restricted by the snow. Stranded travelers at ferry terminals, railroad stations, or streetcar stops could not relay their locations to awaiting friends or family, leaving them exposed to cold and exhaustion. Hospitals struggled to coordinate care for those injured in accidents caused by snow and ice, often relying on couriers who braved treacherous streets on foot. Telegraph operators, however, performed heroic feats under extreme conditions. Many remained at their posts for hours without rest, improvising repairs to lines with available materials. One operator in Lower Manhattan reportedly wrapped sections of exposed wire with cloth and wax to prevent freezing while maintaining continuous communication to Brooklyn. Across the city, operators climbed poles and cleared ice from wires, often risking their lives against gusting winds and snowdrifts that could swallow a person up to their waist. Despite these valiant efforts, the volume of traffic and the damage to infrastructure made full connectivity impossible. Even as communication networks faltered, human ingenuity sought to bridge the gap. Messengers on foot, sleds, or improvised carts carried urgent dispatches between offices, families, and municipal agencies. Churches, saloons, and public halls became informal information centers where neighbors shared reports and alerts. While these grassroots solutions mitigated some risk, they were inconsistent and limited by the same environmental obstacles that immobilized transportation. The blizzard also exposed systemic vulnerabilities in the city's communication design. Telegraph lines and telephone lines were almost entirely above ground, exposed to ice, wind, and falling branches. Newspaper delivery relied on surface transport, making it highly susceptible to snow accumulation and drifting. Even emergency networks lacked redundancy. Fire alarms depended on mechanical boxes along streets that were often buried under snow, delaying alerts. The storm revealed a profound need for protected, resilient infrastructure that could maintain connectivity even when the surface environment was hostile. For many New Yorkers, the isolation created by the communication collapse was as frightening as the snow itself. Residents discovered that the streets they had relied on for quick assistance were impassable. The telegraph offices could not relay messages, and the new technology of the telephone was unreliable. Panic, while sporadic, surfaced as families worried for the safety of distant relatives, and businesses feared the economic consequences of delayed information. The blizzard had not only immobilized the city physically, but had severed its informational lifelines, demonstrating that modern urban life depended as much on reliable communication as on roads, railways, and horse-drawn carriages. By March 14th, after nearly 48 hours of continuous storm, the consequences of the communication breakdown were starkly visible. Streets and avenues remained snowbound, elevated trains and streetcars were immobilized, and ferries still could not cross ice-strewn rivers. Newspapers struggled to produce timely editions, telegraph lines were only partially restored, and telephone exchanges were overwhelmed. Emergency services functioned at minimal capacity, relying on human messengers and local coordination to maintain any semblance of order. The city had been pushed to the edge of isolation, underscoring that transportation and communication were interdependent and equally vulnerable. The blizzard's communication crisis had long-term implications. Observing the failure of above-ground telegraph and telephone networks, engineers and city planners began considering solutions that would insulate critical infrastructure from environmental extremes. These insights contributed directly to the thinking that would underlie New York City's first subway system. By placing transportation underground, planners realized they could simultaneously protect communication lines, ensure uninterrupted travel, and provide resilience against storms of the magnitude of the Great Blizzard. In summary, the Great Blizzard of 1888 demonstrated with brutal clarity that New York City's surface-level communication networks were fragile and insufficient. Telegraph lines froze or broke, telephones failed, newspapers could not keep pace, and residents were left isolated in the midst of emergency conditions. The chaos forced both citizens and officials to improvise, revealing heroism, ingenuity, and the limitations of contemporary urban design. The lessons learned during this period would resonate for decades, shaping the city's approach to transportation, communication, and emergency preparedness.
Rescue efforts and human stories. By March 13th and 14th, as the Great Blizzard of 1888 raged with unrelenting force, New York City's streets had become landscapes of chaos. Drifts rose to 6, 8, and even 10 feet in exposed areas, burying horse-drawn carriages, blocking streetcars, and cutting off entire neighborhoods. Ferries were immobilized, and elevated trains groaned under snow and ice. In this environment, ordinary citizens were forced to confront extraordinary circumstances, and extraordinary stories of survival and heroism began to unfold. The city's emergency services were among the first to act, despite the overwhelming conditions. Firefighters, equipped with horse-drawn engines and hand-pulled hoses, struggled to reach blazes in streets blocked by drifts and abandoned carriages. Horses, crucial to moving engines, frequently collapsed under the weight of snow or were trapped entirely. In many cases, firefighters dismounted and hauled engines and equipment by hand, often through waist-deep snow. The bravery of these men was extraordinary. Facing freezing winds, near-zero visibility, and treacherous footing, they prioritized life-saving missions over personal safety, rescuing residents trapped in tenements or responding to fires that might have otherwise consumed entire blocks. Police officers, too, were on the front lines, patrolling streets on foot to maintain order, prevent looting, and assist stranded citizens. They helped families dig out trapped carriages, guided pedestrians across snow-blocked avenues, and coordinated with fire brigades to reach those most in need. In some neighborhoods, police and volunteers formed human chains to deliver essential supplies, food, firewood, and coal to households cut off by drifts. These efforts were not limited to organized services. Ordinary citizens frequently stepped into roles of leadership and rescue, demonstrating resilience and solidarity in the face of crisis. Across the city, personal stories of endurance and improvisation emerged, creating a rich tapestry of human experience during the storm. One account described a family in the Lower East Side trapped on the upper floors of a tenement whose front steps were buried under 5 feet of snow. Neighbors, armed with shovels and ladders, dug a path through the drift, braving wind and ice to deliver food and water. In Brooklyn Heights, a group of merchants collaborated to form a relay, carrying essential goods through drifts from one block to another to reach elderly residents isolated in their homes. Children, often frightened and restless, were enlisted to assist with carrying small supplies, turning survival into a communal effort. Stranded commuters and travelers faced equally harrowing circumstances. Streetcar passengers stuck mid-route huddled together for warmth while waiting for rescue crews to clear snowdrifts. Railroad passengers, trapped in stations or stalled trains, endured long hours in cold, uncomfortable conditions, relying on blankets, coal stoves, or improvised heating from small fires. Ferrymen, unable to dock their vessels due to ice-blocked piers, guided stranded passengers to makeshift shelters on shore, sometimes carrying the sick or elderly across slippery ice to safety. The city, immobilized and isolated, became a theater of human ingenuity and endurance. Acts of heroism were often spontaneous and deeply human. Citizens formed networks of aid, patrolling streets and alleys to identify those at greatest risk. Volunteers carved pathways for neighbors, carried firewood to those unable to reach stores, and assisted in delivering medical care. In one notable incident, a group of men and boys in the Bronx used sleds and planks to transport food and medicine to a family whose residence had been completely buried by snow. In Lower Manhattan, a young clerk rescued a child trapped in a streetcar by climbing onto the roof and carefully guiding the child to safety. These stories, countless in number, illustrated the extraordinary human response to the blizzard's unprecedented challenges. Firemen faced particularly daunting conditions when responding to emergencies caused directly by the storm. Stoves in poorly insulated homes often overheated or malfunctioned, igniting fires. Snow and ice prevented standard hose deployment, forcing firefighters to dig trenches to reach hydrants or carry water manually from cisterns. Collapsed roofs caused by the weight of snow required swift intervention to prevent injury or death. Despite exhaustion and exposure, fire crews maintained vigilance, working around the clock to mitigate both the immediate danger of the storm and the secondary disasters it triggered. Medical personnel also confronted severe challenges. Hospitals, often relying on horse-drawn ambulances and foot messengers, were overwhelmed with patients suffering frostbite, hypothermia, injuries from falls, and accidents involving collapsed structures or streetcar mishaps. Physicians and nurses worked in extreme conditions, improvising when roads were blocked or supplies delayed. Volunteer groups, including neighbors and charitable organizations, assisted with transportation, tending to the sick, and delivering food or medicine. The crisis highlighted both the bravery of professionals and the importance of community networks during emergencies. The human dimension of the storm extended to economic survival as well. Street vendors, shopkeepers, and market workers were forced to improvise in order to maintain some semblance of commerce. Frozen carts were dug out and moved manually. Shops opened briefly to sell essentials to the few who could reach them. Cooperative efforts emerged to share scarce resources across neighborhoods. While many businesses suffered losses, the improvisational spirit of New Yorkers ensured that some access to food, firewood, and other necessities remained. In addition to rescue and survival, the blizzard fostered extraordinary cooperation across social divides. Wealthier citizens often assisted neighbors in poorer districts, sharing resources or lending manpower to clear snow. Immigrant communities relied on networks of mutual aid to protect vulnerable residents, distribute provisions, and maintain communication despite telegraph and telephone failures. Children participated in small but meaningful ways, helping carry supplies or assisting elders in navigating deep drifts. The blizzard, while devastating, revealed the profound resilience and solidarity of a city forced to confront nature's fury together. By March 15th, after more than 72 hours of relentless snow, wind, and cold, the rescue efforts began to transition from immediate survival to restoration of normalcy. Streets were partially cleared, emergency services stabilized, and the first wave of essential deliveries reached previously isolated neighborhoods. Yet the lessons of the storm remained stark. The city's surface infrastructure, streets, elevated trains, ferries, and horse-drawn vehicles, was vulnerable to extreme weather. Communication networks were fragile, emergency services were strained, and citizens had been left to improvise for survival. The heroic efforts of firefighters, police, medical personnel, and ordinary citizens saved countless lives and mitigated disaster. Their actions demonstrated the extraordinary capacity for human endurance and community cooperation. At the same time, the blizzard revealed systemic weaknesses that demanded long-term solutions. Urban planners, engineers, and civic leaders began seriously considering underground transportation and protected infrastructure as the only viable method to prevent future paralysis. The combination of chaos and heroism would become a defining narrative of the Great Blizzard, shaping public memory and inspiring innovation in the years to come.
Economic and social impact. As March 15th dawned over New York City, the immediate physical chaos of the Great Blizzard of 1888 began to give way to a broader realization. The storm had created a profound economic and social crisis. Streets buried under 10 feet of snow, transportation paralyzed, and communication networks crippled meant that daily commerce, trade, and labor were effectively suspended. The city's economy, normally vibrant and ceaseless, experienced a near-total freeze, revealing both the vulnerabilities and resilience of urban life. Merchants and shopkeepers were among the first to feel the financial strain. Street-level businesses in Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn remained shuttered for days, unable to reach suppliers or customers. Grocery stores, bakeries, and butchers struggled to provide essentials as deliveries were delayed or entirely blocked by snowdrifts. Markets were particularly hard hit. Vendors attempting to sell fresh produce, meat, or dairy often found themselves isolated, with frozen goods spoiled or rendered inaccessible. Wealthier districts faced similar disruptions. The residents with private resources could rely on stored provisions or laborers willing to brave the storm. Larger commercial operations also suffered dramatically. Factories, shipping companies, and warehouses experienced delays as horse-drawn transport, ferries, and railroads stalled. Long Island Railroad and New York Central Railroad reported significant interruptions in freight movement, delaying coal, foodstuffs, and manufactured goods to and from the city. Shipping along the East River and the harbor came to a virtual halt, with ice flows and turbulent waters preventing docking or unloading. Financial institutions, including banks and insurance companies, saw disruptions in operations as clerks and employees struggled to reach offices. The New York Stock Exchange experienced reduced attendance, and communication with outlying regions was slowed, threatening both local and regional trade. Workers faced immediate hardships. Laborers dependent on daily wages, dock workers, streetcar employees, delivery drivers, and domestic servants were left without income for the duration of the storm. Those who could not travel safely to their places of work were often unable to earn money for essential provisions. Meanwhile, employees of larger businesses faced the dual challenge of lost wages and increased difficulty in accessing supplies or attending to families trapped in isolated neighborhoods. Immigrant communities, densely populated in Manhattan, Brooklyn, and the Bronx, were especially vulnerable. Their reliance on surface transportation, limited savings, and crowded living conditions amplified the social consequences of the blizzard. Food scarcity became a pressing concern. With streets impassable and delivery networks halted, supplies of fresh milk, bread, and meat were limited. Merchants who could reach neighborhoods often charged higher prices to compensate for the difficulty, exacerbating economic disparities. Residents improvised, families rationed food, neighbors shared resources, and community networks organized to provide essentials to those most in need. The storm highlighted stark inequalities in access to resources, making survival in some parts of the city a matter of both planning and sheer luck. The social consequences extended beyond economics. Isolation caused by the storm disrupted social networks, community institutions, and public services. Schools were closed for days, leaving children confined indoors. Churches, theaters, and public halls remained largely inaccessible, curtailing social life and cultural engagement. Hospitals, already challenged by transportation and communication disruptions, faced increased demand for care related to frostbite, hypothermia, and accidents. Public morale was tested, and anxiety ran high among families unsure of the welfare of relatives or neighbors in stranded neighborhoods. The blizzard also had long-term economic implications. Businesses lost revenue not only during the storm but in its aftermath, as recovery required time, labor, and capital. Deliveries delayed for days meant spoiled goods and missed contracts. Insurance claims for property damage, collapsed roofs, and transportation accidents surged, creating additional financial strain for commercial and residential entities. City infrastructure required urgent repairs, streets needed clearing, debris removed, and damaged public transportation equipment restored. The storm exposed weaknesses in both private and municipal preparedness, highlighting the economic cost of unprotected infrastructure. Amid the crisis, however, the blizzard also revealed resilience and ingenuity. Citizens adapted to new realities, finding creative ways to navigate snow-laden streets, deliver essential goods, and maintain communication. Volunteer networks organized for mutual aid, bridging gaps left by disrupted services. Businesses improvised alternative delivery methods, sometimes collaborating with neighbors or competitors to reach customers. These adaptations demonstrated the capacity of urban communities to respond to extraordinary challenges even when formal systems failed. The economic and social impacts were compounded by the sheer psychological toll of the storm.
Residents faced exhaustion from clearing snow, fear from isolation, and concern for vulnerable neighbors or family members. Ordinary winter inconveniences, such as delayed errands or minor disruptions, transformed into life-threatening challenges, forcing citizens to recalibrate priorities and routines. Stories of hardship and heroism circulated quickly, reinforcing social cohesion even amid chaos. Perhaps most importantly, the blizzard crystallized the realization that New York City's infrastructure was dangerously vulnerable to extreme weather events. Transportation paralysis, disrupted communication, and economic losses revealed that surface-level systems, horses, streetcars, ferries, and telegraph lines were insufficient to sustain the city during extraordinary circumstances. City planners, engineers, and civic leaders began to contemplate long-term solutions that could protect both commerce and citizens from future disasters. These reflections laid the groundwork for the transformative response that would follow, the creation of the modern subway system, a resilient underground network designed to keep the city moving no matter the weather. By March 16th, as the storm's intensity finally began to wane, New Yorkers emerged from their homes into a city transformed. Streets remained buried in drifts, some neighborhoods isolated for days. Businesses assessed the damage and reorganized supply chains, while families inventoried provisions and repaired property. The economic and social disruptions, though profound, also sparked conversations about urban planning, emergency preparedness, and resilience. The city had survived, but at enormous cost, and the lessons learned would resonate for decades. The Great Blizzard of 1888 thus left an indelible mark not only on streets, buildings, and daily routines, but on the collective consciousness of the city. Economic paralysis and social strain exposed the vulnerabilities of above-ground systems, while human ingenuity and communal support demonstrated the resilience of New Yorkers. These intertwined realities, the devastation and the heroism, shaped the city's approach to infrastructure, emergency planning, and public safety, ultimately inspiring the creation of innovations that would prevent similar crises in the future.
The storm's environmental fury. By March 12, 1888, the Great Blizzard had escalated from an ordinary winter storm to a catastrophic weather event, the likes of which New York City had rarely experienced. The meteorological conditions were extreme. Wind speeds exceeded 45 miles per hour, snow fell in relentless sheets, and drifting created snow accumulations that buried carriages, stairways, and even entire sections of streets. The blizzard's environmental fury was not merely a backdrop to the city's suffering, it was the primary force shaping human experience, revealing vulnerabilities in infrastructure, transportation, and daily life. Snowfall totals were staggering. Across Manhattan, snow accumulated at rates of 2 to 4 inches per hour, with some drifts rising to heights of 10 to 15 feet where the wind funneled snow into narrow streets and avenues. Brooklyn, Queens, and parts of the Bronx reported similar extremes, while Long Island saw even greater accumulation. The sheer volume of snow overwhelmed the city's ability to clear streets, maintain transportation, or reach those in need. By the storm's end, an estimated 50 inches of snow had blanketed New York City, with drifts in exposed locations far exceeding that amount. Wind played a critical role in amplifying the blizzard's effects. Gusts of up to 50 miles per hour transformed falling snow into nearly horizontal sheets, reducing visibility to mere feet in open areas. These whiteout conditions disoriented pedestrians, trapped horse-drawn vehicles, and rendered navigation nearly impossible. Snowbanks formed in chaotic patterns as gusts funneled snow into corners, doorways, and alleyways.
Elevated rail lines, designed for efficiency, groaned and swayed under the combined forces of wind and ice, further immobilizing public transportation. The relentless wind also drove waves of icy water across the East and Hudson rivers, grounding ferries and threatening docks with floating ice flows. Icebound vessels left crews stranded for hours or days, requiring extraordinary improvisation to prevent loss of life and property. Even inland rivers feeding into New York's supply chains experienced partial freezing, delaying deliveries and compounding economic disruption. Temperature extremes intensified the storm's severity. Daytime highs remained below freezing, while nighttime lows plunged well below 0 Fahrenheit, exacerbating frostbite, hypothermia, and exposure risks for anyone caught outside. Snow that fell in liquid form initially froze upon contact, forming slippery layers that trapped carriages and pedestrians. Combined with wind chill, these conditions created an environment where mere minutes outdoors could be dangerous, amplifying the human and logistical challenges of the storm. The environmental fury of the blizzard was further amplified by the storm's duration. Snow fell continuously for nearly 3 days, with minimal respite, while gusts and drifting snow maintained a state of constant hazard. This extended duration prevented effective clearing of streets or restoration of services, leaving the city immobilized. Even after the snowfall slowed, wind-driven drifting continued to pile snow into new accumulations, prolonging paralysis and delaying recovery. Reports from contemporary observers emphasized the storm's overwhelming force. Windows rattled under gusting winds, elevated trains swayed precariously on icy tracks, and sidewalks vanished under deep drifts. Ferries and docked vessels creaked under the weight of ice, while telegraph lines snapped or sagged perilously. In these conditions, daily life ceased, replaced by a struggle to survive, navigate, and adapt to an environment dominated entirely by nature's power. The environmental fury of the blizzard revealed a crucial insight. New York City's infrastructure, transportation, communication, commerce, and public services was wholly exposed to the elements. Horses, streetcars, elevated trains, ferries, and telegraph lines were all vulnerable to the combination of snow, ice, wind, and extreme cold. For the first time, the city confronted the reality that weather could immobilize its entire surface-level system, highlighting the urgent need for protected, resilient alternatives. This meteorological catastrophe also reinforced the psychological strain on residents. People confined indoors faced isolation, fear, and the uncertainty of what lay beyond their doors. Pedestrians attempting to venture out risked being lost in blinding whiteout conditions, trapped in drifts, or injured by falling ice and collapsing structures. The blizzard's relentless environmental force imposed a constant threat, demonstrating the absolute dominance of nature over urban life when preparation and infrastructure fell short. The Great Blizzard of 1888's environmental fury, therefore, was more than just a backdrop. It was the defining force of the event. Snow, wind, ice, and temperature extremes combined to halt transportation, disrupt communication, challenge human endurance, and threaten life itself. By exposing the city's vulnerabilities, the storm forced planners, engineers, and civic leaders to reconsider the design of New York City, ultimately catalyzing the move towards subterranean transit systems and more resilient urban infrastructure. By the time the storm finally abated, the city had been transformed. Streets were buried under towering drifts, communication lines were damaged, and above-ground transportation was immobilized. Yet the blizzard had also left a profound lesson that urban life, no matter how sophisticated, was at the mercy of environmental forces unless safeguarded by innovation, foresight, and engineering. This lesson would drive the creation of the modern subway and redefine the city's approach to mobility, communication, and resilience for generations.
Aftermath and cleanup. By March 16, 1888, the great blizzard that had paralyzed New York City for days finally began to abate. Snowfall slowed, wind gusts lessened, and visibility gradually returned. Yet the storm's retreat revealed the full extent of its devastation. Streets buried under 10-foot drifts, horse-drawn carriages crushed or abandoned, streetcars and elevated trains immobilized, and communication networks still struggling to function. The city faced a monumental task: clearing the snow, restoring services, and re-establishing daily life while grappling with the human, economic, and infrastructural consequences of an unprecedented winter disaster. Cleanup efforts began immediately, although they were hindered by the sheer scale of the snow. Municipal workers and volunteers formed large teams to dig out streets, sidewalks, and intersections. Shovels, picks, plows, and horse-drawn carts became essential tools in a labor-intensive effort to reopen the city. Streets in Manhattan's crowded neighborhoods, particularly Lower Manhattan, were painstakingly cleared by hand, as mechanical plows could not yet handle drifts of such extraordinary height. Teams worked around the clock, rotating in shifts to combat exhaustion and prevent frostbite and hypothermia among laborers. Above-ground transportation restoration was a top priority. Streetcar crews attempted to free cars buried beneath snow, repair frozen tracks, and restore overhead wires. Horses, fatigued or lost during the storm, were replaced or cared for by veterinarians and volunteers. Elevated trains were inspected for structural damage caused by ice and heavy snow, with crews climbing tracks and clearing debris before service could resume. Ferries were freed from ice-blocked docks and returned cautiously to river traffic, with crews constantly monitoring frozen waterways for dangerous ice flows. Railroads leading into the city required extensive clearing and repair, as switch points, rails, and signals had frozen or been damaged during the storm. Telegraph and telephone systems, critical for coordinating recovery efforts, also required extensive repair. Broken lines were replaced, poles reinforced, and wires manually cleared of ice. Telegraph operators and telephone exchange workers faced grueling shifts, reconnecting neighborhoods and restoring communication between municipal offices, hospitals, and private businesses. Newspapers resumed production, though distribution remained challenging due to partially cleared streets and damaged delivery routes. Despite these obstacles, the city slowly regained the ability to transmit news, orders, and vital information. The human effort during cleanup was immense. Residents returned to the streets with shovels, axes, and makeshift tools to dig out homes, tenements, and local businesses. Volunteers assisted neighbors, particularly the elderly and infirm, who could not navigate the drifts alone. Community networks that had been crucial during the storm itself continued to function, distributing supplies, clearing access, and coordinating efforts across neighborhoods. Social cohesion and mutual aid remained critical as the city undertook one of the largest cleanup operations in its history. Cleanup also revealed widespread property damage. Roofs collapsed under the weight of snow and ice, fences and lampposts were bent or broken, and carriages and wagons were crushed. Water damage from melting snow threatened lower floors of buildings, particularly in basement apartments common in poorer districts. Businesses assessed losses caused by spoiled goods, delayed deliveries, and structural damage, while residents inventoried personal property that had been damaged or destroyed. Insurance claims began to mount, though payouts were often delayed by ongoing communication and transportation disruptions. The storm left a profound psychological mark on the city's inhabitants. Residents emerged from the blizzard to a landscape at once familiar and alien. Streets unrecognizable beneath massive drifts, transportation slowly resuming, and neighborhoods showing signs of both destruction and resilience. While the cleanup offered a sense of progress, the magnitude of the storm instilled lasting awareness of vulnerability. Ordinary routines, commuting, shopping, attending school, had been disrupted for days, reminding citizens that nature could temporarily seize control of even the most densely populated urban environment. Economic recovery, though gradual, was bolstered by ingenuity and cooperation.
Merchants reopened shops as soon as access was cleared, while neighbors assisted each other in salvaging goods, repairing property, and transporting essentials. Transportation companies worked tirelessly to restore regular service, recognizing that the city's commercial and social life depended on functional mobility. Public agencies, meanwhile, analyzed the failures exposed by the storm, identifying weaknesses in surface transportation, snow removal, communication, and emergency response. These assessments would influence urban planning and engineering decisions for decades to come. One of the most critical outcomes of the cleanup was the recognition that above-ground infrastructure alone was insufficient for a city of New York's size and density. The paralysis caused by the storm demonstrated that reliance on horse-drawn vehicles, streetcars, elevated trains, and ferries left the city vulnerable to even a single extreme weather event. Civic leaders, engineers, and planners began discussing alternative approaches, including underground transit routes, protected communication lines, and snow-resistant designs for essential services. These conversations laid the foundation for the creation of the modern subway system, a direct response to the vulnerabilities made visible by the blizzard. By late March, after days of relentless labor, most streets and key transit routes were passable once more. Elevated trains resumed limited service, streetcars traversed cleared avenues, ferries returned to the rivers, and communication networks functioned reliably again. Yet the memory of the blizzard remained vivid, a stark reminder of the fragility of urban infrastructure and the extraordinary human effort required to restore order. The aftermath of the Great Blizzard of 1888 was thus both a story of destruction and a story of resilience. While the storm had immobilized transportation, disrupted communication, caused property damage, and strained the city's economy, it also demonstrated the capacity of citizens, emergency responders, and municipal workers to adapt, improvise, and cooperate under extreme conditions. The cleanup process, arduous and extensive, highlighted the need for durable solutions and infrastructure innovation. Insights that would shape the city's approach to urban planning, emergency preparedness, and public transportation for generations to come.
Political and civic response. In the immediate aftermath of the Great Blizzard of 1888, New York City was a city both paralyzed and illuminated by its own fragility. As the snow began to subside and the streets gradually reopened, city officials confronted the full scale of the crisis. The political and civic response to the blizzard would prove as consequential as the storm itself, laying the groundwork for urban innovations that reshaped the city and ultimately led to the creation of the modern subway system. Mayor Abram Hewitt, who had assumed office in 1887, faced unprecedented pressure. The storm had immobilized the city, disrupted commerce, and endangered thousands of residents. Hewitt and his administration received urgent reports from across Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens, detailing stranded citizens, collapsed roofs, blocked streets, and failures in transportation and communication. The blizzard had revealed the limits of municipal preparedness, challenging leadership to coordinate emergency responses while simultaneously planning for long-term mitigation. City agencies began immediate assessments of the damage. The Department of Public Works organized teams to evaluate street conditions, remove snow, and repair infrastructure. Engineers documented failures in horse-drawn carriage networks, streetcars, elevated train lines, and ferry operations. Police and fire departments submitted detailed reports on operational challenges, including inaccessible areas, frozen hydrants, and stranded personnel. These assessments highlighted a common theme: above-ground infrastructure was excessively vulnerable to severe weather, and reliance on surface systems left the city exposed. Discussions among civic leaders quickly turned to long-term solutions. The storm's impact on transportation was particularly striking.
Elevated trains, streetcars, and ferries had all been rendered unreliable by snow and ice, with delays lasting days and leaving essential workers, businesses, and families stranded. City planners recognized that protecting transit from the elements was critical to maintaining urban life during future storms. Engineers began to revisit proposals for underground transit routes, previously considered costly or experimental, now framed as essential to the city's survival. Political debate also emerged over the role of municipal responsibility in urban infrastructure. Some officials argued that the blizzard had revealed the need for stronger city oversight, including regulation of private streetcar lines and ferries, improved emergency coordination, and investment in snow removal equipment. Others highlighted the importance of private sector cooperation, noting that railroads, telegraph companies, and utility providers bore responsibility for resilience and continuity during extreme weather events. The blizzard catalyzed discussions about public-private partnerships, infrastructure investment, and civic accountability. Engineers and architects presented detailed proposals based on the storm's lessons. Underground tunnels for streetcars and pedestrian passage, insulated or heated tracks, and protected stations were discussed as ways to prevent a repeat of the surface-level paralysis. Telegraph and telephone lines, vulnerable to ice and wind, were proposed for relocation underground, ensuring continuous communication during emergencies. Bridges, elevated railways, and other above-ground structures were reconsidered with new materials and designs to withstand heavy snow and wind. Civic committees studied European examples, particularly London's subterranean rail system, weighing feasibility, cost, and potential benefits for New York. Public opinion played a key role in shaping the political response. Newspapers documented the blizzard's devastation in vivid detail, highlighting stranded citizens, collapsed roofs, frozen transportation networks, and heroic rescue efforts. Editorials called for citywide investment in modern transit solutions and criticized officials for failing to anticipate such a storm. Citizens, having endured isolation and hardship, demanded improvements to infrastructure that would prevent future disruptions. This groundswell of public attention created political momentum for transformative urban planning initiatives. Mayor Hewitt convened emergency committees to review both immediate and long-term needs. Proposals included expanded snow removal forces, early warning systems for extreme weather, municipal oversight of critical transit lines, and preliminary planning for underground transit corridors. These discussions reflected a dual objective: restoring normalcy after the blizzard while investing in long-term resilience to prevent a recurrence of the paralysis experienced in March 1888. City engineers also began to document data that would inform future subway construction. Snow accumulation patterns, drift behavior along streets, and wind velocity data were collected to determine where underground routes could be most effective. Areas most vulnerable to isolation, particularly Lower Manhattan, Brooklyn, and East River crossings, were prioritized. These technical assessments, combined with the political impetus created by the storm, directly influenced the routes, designs, and construction methods that would later define New York City's subway system. The blizzard prompted legislation and municipal planning efforts as well. City officials initiated inquiries into the responsibilities of private transit companies, requirements for street and sidewalk maintenance, and emergency preparedness protocols. Committees were established to review disaster response procedures, ensure coordination across agencies, and make recommendations for infrastructure improvements. While some proposals were implemented immediately, such as expanded snow removal teams and improved communication between city departments, others, like underground transit planning, required years of design, negotiation, and construction before realization. By the spring of 1888, the political and civic response had crystallized into a vision for a more resilient city. The storm had forced acknowledgement that New York's reliance on above-ground systems, horses, streetcars, ferries, and telegraph lines, was untenable during extreme weather. Civic leaders, engineers, and the public shared a new consensus. The city required infrastructure that was insulated from the elements, capable of maintaining mobility, commerce, and communication even in the harshest conditions. In retrospect, the political and civic response to the Great Blizzard of 1888 was pivotal. While immediate actions addressed the challenges of snow removal, transportation restoration, and public safety, the storm also catalyzed long-term planning that transformed urban design. Discussions about underground transit, protected communication lines, and resilient infrastructure laid the foundation for the modern subway, demonstrating how crisis can accelerate innovation and reshape a city's future. The blizzard's legacy in political and civic spheres was therefore twofold. It exposed systemic weaknesses in urban infrastructure and governance, and it prompted forward-looking solutions that would protect the city from similar disasters. Officials, engineers, and citizens collectively recognized that a modern metropolis required not just surface-level functionality, but resilience built into the very design of its streets, rails, and utilities, a realization that would define New York City's transformation in the decades following the storm.
Legacy and the birth of the subway. By the spring of 1888, the immediate aftermath of the Great Blizzard had begun to fade, but its lessons remained vivid in the minds of New Yorkers, city officials, engineers, and civic leaders. The storm had exposed vulnerabilities in transportation, communication, and emergency response, revealing that the city's above-ground infrastructure, horses, streetcars, ferries, and elevated trains, was wholly inadequate during extreme weather events. The paralysis, isolation, and hardship experienced during those days of relentless snow prompted a collective reevaluation of how New York could move millions of people efficiently, safely, and reliably, regardless of the elements. The idea of an underground transit system, which had existed only as speculative discussion or European inspiration, gained newfound urgency. Engineers and city planners revisited studies of London's tube system and Paris's subterranean rail networks, analyzing their feasibility from New York's dense and sprawling urban environment. Unlike European cities, New York faced unique challenges: a rapidly growing population, crowded streets, extensive waterways, and diverse topography. Yet the blizzard's lessons, immobilized carriages, stranded commuters, and impassable streets made the need for an insulated subterranean transit system unmistakable. In the months following the blizzard, civic leaders, private investors, and engineers collaborated to formalize plans for a modern subway. Proposals emphasized routes that connected the most densely populated neighborhoods, key commercial districts, and vital transportation hubs. Lessons from the storm directly influenced these designs. Tunnels would run underground to avoid snow and ice, stations would be enclosed and insulated to protect passengers, and critical lines for communication and electrical infrastructure would be integrated to ensure continuous operation. The concept was no longer experimental. It was a necessity born from a natural disaster. Public support for the subway concept grew rapidly. Newspapers chronicled the devastation caused by the storm, emphasizing the disruption to commerce, transportation, and daily life. Citizens who had experienced isolation, stranded families, and immobilized neighborhoods demanded solutions that could prevent future paralysis. Editorials urged immediate action, while city meetings became forums of discussion of routes, technology, and municipal oversight. The blizzard had not only revealed vulnerabilities, but had galvanized public opinion around the idea of safe, reliable, weatherproof transit.
Construction planning and engineering work began in earnest in the early 1990s, informed by the experiences of the blizzard. Engineers applied lessons learned from snow accumulation patterns, wind behavior, and urban congestion to the design of tunnels, ventilation systems, and station layouts. Safety considerations, accessibility, and emergency preparedness were prioritized, reflecting the failures witnessed during the storm. Elevated trains and surface-level streetcars remained important, but planners recognized that only an underground system could provide the resilience needed for a modern metropolis. The first subway line, eventually opening in 1904, was a direct descendant of the lessons learned during the Great Blizzard of 1888. It represented a triumph of engineering, civic planning, and human foresight, providing a reliable alternative to surface transportation that could operate regardless of weather conditions. Commuters could traverse Manhattan efficiently, safely, and comfortably, even during severe winter storms, and the city's economy, communication, and social life became far more resilient. Beyond transportation, the blizzard's legacy influenced urban planning, emergency preparedness, and infrastructure design. City officials implemented more robust snow removal policies, improved communication networks, and established protocols for coordinated emergency response. Building codes were reassessed to prevent roof collapses under heavy snow, and public awareness campaigns educated citizens about storm preparedness. The blizzard became a case study in urban vulnerability and resilience, influencing generations of planners, engineers, and policymakers. Culturally, the storm became part of New York's collective memory. Stories of heroism, survival, and communal effort were passed down through newspapers, memoirs, and oral histories. The blizzard's narrative underscored both the power of nature and the capacity of human ingenuity to respond to extreme adversity. Its lessons endured not only in infrastructure and engineering, but in the city's identity as a metropolis capable of overcoming even the most formidable natural challenges. In retrospect, the Great Blizzard of 1888 was a catalyst for transformation. It revealed the limitations of surface-level systems, forced the city to confront the consequences of vulnerability, and inspired one of the most ambitious engineering projects in American urban history, the creation of the modern subway. The underground transit system, born from crisis, became a symbol of New York City's resilience, innovation, and capacity to adapt. It allowed millions of residents to move efficiently, safely, and reliably, fundamentally reshaping urban life and laying the foundation for the city's emergence as a global metropolis. The blizzard's legacy is evident every day beneath the streets of New York. Trains glide through tunnels insulated from snow and ice. Stations hum with activity even during winter storms, and millions of commuters rely on a system conceived in response to a single extraordinary event. The Great Blizzard of 1888, once a symbol of immobilization and chaos, became the inspiration for a transformative infrastructure innovation that continues to serve the city more than a century later. In the end, the storm demonstrated a profound truth. Human ingenuity, civic planning, and engineering excellence can overcome even the most extreme natural forces. The modern subway, an underground lifeline of New York City, stands as a testament to the lessons learned from those harrowing days of snow, wind, and ice, a legacy of resilience forged in the heart of one of America's greatest storms.